Okay, welcome to lecture PowerPoint number 5 on Buddhism. So the first thing we need to establish is the pronunciation of this term. So it is Buddhism. The vowel sound in Buddhism is the same as the vowel sound in the word good. Most people mispronounce it and use the vowel sound in the word food to pronounce Buddhism as Buddhism. It is not Buddhism, like food, Buddhism. It is Buddhism, like good, Buddhism. So, the Buddha taught another alternative to the ritual-oriented Brahmanism. So this comes out of sort of the subcontinent of India. The Brahmanic tradition was very popular in the context that the Buddha was born, and he taught an alternative. The focus of this alternative was on earthly suffering and its cure. So it's really focused on this world. For that reason, for some, it's a philosophy. For others, it's more of a religious path. And we'll sort of grapple with the question of whether you find it to be a philosophy or religion as we proceed. The life and legend of the Buddha. So oral transmissions about his life were not written down for hundreds of years after his death. So there's probably a lot of some unreliability about the life of the Buddha, where it becomes more of a legend. He was born near the border between India and Nepal. His given name is Siddhartha Gautama, which means wish fulfiller. And he was born into wealth but unconvinced of its value. So the legend is that he was a prince. He was living in a palace. He was very sheltered. His father kept him from being aware of death, of sickness, of aging. So it's kind of a legendary feature to the story. But he was unfamiliar with all those concepts and lived this extremely sheltered, sensual, lavish life. I think he was 29, and he had a wife and even a child, and decided to renounce his wealth. So first, he just leaves the palace. And when he leaves the palace, without his father's permission, he saw 4 sights. He saw a bent old man. So he became acquainted with the concept of aging, a sick person, and became acquainted with the concept of illness, a dead person, so he understood death, and an ascetic, someone trying to meditate and overcome earthly suffering. And with these sights, he left his wealth behind to become a sannyasin. And a sannyasin is a Hindu ascetic. It's a word that refers to a Hindu ascetic. So his first 3 sites all dealt with sort of impermanence and that nothing is permanent in life. And then the 4th site represented a way to respond to that impermanence. After 6 years of extreme asceticism, living as a sannyasin in the wilderness, he determined that asceticism does not lead to enlightenment. So he devised the middle way. So he'd experienced a life of extreme sensuality and pleasure for the first 29 years of his life, and then for 6 years experienced extreme self-denial or asceticism. So he rejected both extreme self-indulgence and extreme self-denial and developed the middle way between the two, so that there's some room for indulgence and also some self-denial in classical Buddhism. However, what the life he lived that was in accordance with the middle way was way more self-denying than we would consider like a middle way today. He didn't have any personal possessions. He only had one bit of clothing. He was just sort of like a wandering hermit. So still an extremely ascetic life. He develops the Dharma. So you'll remember in Hinduism, The word dharma just meant like life way, or referred to all the spiritual and religious practices. It's similar in Buddhism. It refers to what you practice in order to attain enlightenment or realization. And the Dharma is comprised of a couple doctrines. One is the doctrine of the Four Noble Truths, which will appear on a later slide and sort of diagnoses the problem with reality that we experience as we experience it. The Noble Eightfold Path is the way to understand how to behave given the Four Noble Truths. And the three marks of existence are the facets of reality that lead to one to realize the Four Noble Truths. But first we need to talk about the Sangha. So the Sangha refers to a monastic order that developed from the Buddha's early disciples. So early on from the get-go in Buddhism, there are monks and nuns. Buddhists accepted people from all castes and levels of society. Unlike Hinduism, they did not acknowledge the caste system. A bhikshuni is an order of nuns that the Buddha himself founded. Nuns were reluctantly admitted to the Sangha, according to legend. And this is disputed. I mean, it could have been possible that the Buddha let nuns in immediately. That seems more likely. However, as institutionalized Buddhism became sort of mirrored the patriarchy of surrounding cultures, there developed this legend, but it might be true that the Buddha originally did not allow nuns, but later came around and allowed them. However, unfortunately, nuns are always subordinate to monks within Buddhist tradition. Even if a nun has been a nun for 50 years, she's subordinate to a monk that's been there for a couple weeks. The Dharma. So Buddhism is a non-theistic tradition. So as you'll remember from the first chapter, non-theism refers to basically not saying yes or no about a god, that it's not relevant. So Buddhism is focused on earthly suffering and its cure, and in that focus, it doesn't feel the need to appeal to a deity. In Buddhist philosophy and traditions in the West, where God was appealed to explain something, Buddhism has been able to get around that. So similar to Hinduism, you don't need to posit an eternal creator to explain why reality exists and why there's something rather than nothing. You can just claim that reality, although in flux, is eternal itself. So that's a similar move that you find in Buddhism. So Buddhism itself is non-theistic, although some Buddhists are theistic and some Buddhists are atheistic. So we'll see both of that as we continue. The Buddha is not to be worshipped. He is understood to just be a human being. In certain Buddhist traditions and other Buddhist traditions, which we'll get to later, he's a little bit more than a human being, but definitely not a god that is to be worshipped. Nirvana is the goal or liberation of Buddhism. To attain nirvana, when you become enlightened, you attain nirvana. Nirvana means to extinguish, literally, and that reading is probably referring to the extinguishing of suffering, and it is the goal of spiritual effort or liberation. So you attain a state of enlightenment, and then you sort of attain nirvana consequently from that. So now on to the Four Noble Truths. So the Buddha taught that life inevitably involves suffering, dissatisfaction, and distress. And these things are known as dukkha. So suffering, dissatisfaction, and distress are dukkha. Suffering is caused by craving or desire rooted in ignorance. Suffering will cease when craving or desire ceases. And there is a way to realize this state, the Noble Eightfold Path. So some of this makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think we often experience ourselves as creatures that are just always moving on to the next desire. And when we get our desires fulfilled, we might be satisfied for a time, but then we're off striving for something else. And the experience of desiring something and not having it can be often unpleasant. Um, and we'll make more sense of the Four Noble Truths as we move forward. So they make sense in light of the three marks of existence. So the first is dukkha, which is pain, suffering, dissatisfaction. So life inevitably involves dukkha. Another mark of existence is anitya, which means impermanence, that absolutely nothing in reality is permanent. Everything in reality is impermanent. Reality is in flux. It is in motion. It is not still. Everything within it is subject to change. And the third mark of existence gets a little confusing. It is the anatman. And you'll remember in Hinduism, the atman means self or soul. So the anatman is a doctrine of no self or non-self. So to explain what that means, we have some quotes from the textbook. What we regard as self is an ever-changing bundle of fleeting feelings, sense impressions, ideas, and evanescent physical matter. And then one more quote, a human being is an impermanent composite of interdependent physical, emotional, and cognitive components. So if you think about how we experience ourselves, it's really hard to pinpoint what about ourselves would be the soul, given that every aspect of our personality, our ways of thinking, is subject to change over time and sometimes can change rather abruptly given certain environmental influences. When you think about what you are, it seems like you're something peeking out from behind your eyes, but when you think about the content of your sense of I, it's always some sort of perception of hot or cold, light or dark, some emotional perception. And Buddhists are saying the I is sort of like a built-in function. The I, or the self, is a built-in function for experiencing perceptions, but that really all that exists are these perceptions. They're just sort of structured to give you a sense that of a self or a soul, but really all you are these fleeting perceptions. There really is no self or soul. So it's a radically different concept of self than in Hinduism and then in much of Western thought as well. The Noble Eightfold Path to Liberation. So given life is impermanent and everything in it is subject to change, it does not make sense to attach and want to grasp and desire things strongly because anything you desire is subject to change. So in light of the three marks of existence and the Four Noble Truths, this is what the Buddha put forward as a path of ethical conduct, concentration, and wisdom with the goal of liberation and enlightenment. So the first is right understanding, and I'm just going to kind of plow through these. You don't need to memorize these. Right understanding, comprehending reality correctly through deep realization of the Four Noble Truths, seeing through illusions. So one illusion would be that things have permanence or exist in and of themselves. Right thought and motivations to become free from the limits of self-centeredness. Right speech, using communication only for truth and harmony. Right action, to avoid destroying life, stealing, sexual misconduct, lying, and intoxicants. And they continue, right livelihood, making sure that one's way of making a living does not violate the other precepts. Right effort, striving continually to eliminate the impurities of the mind and diligently cultivating wholesome actions of body, speech, and mind. Joyful effort is the antidote to laziness. Right mindfulness, disciplined cultivation of awareness moment to moment. And mindfulness is becoming kind of a buzzword. And basically it just means being radically present in the moment, not time traveling in your head to the past or the future, but being totally and fully aware of the moment and fully present. And it often coincides with meditation. So right meditation applies discipline to quiet the mind and develop single-pointed concentration. So the way you start off meditating, which I have some experience with, is you sit and you observe your thoughts, and you don't identify with them the way you normally would in your everyday experience. Like, I am angry, but like I feel anger within me. I'm experiencing this fleeting anger within me. I'm just letting the thought or feeling arise and pass, and non-judgmentally observing that. And that practice allows you to be more mindful in your everyday life and respond more willfully in the moment. And then we have a quote at the end from Fisher: "When the mind is completely stilled, it becomes a quiet pool in which the true nature of things is clearly reflected." So kind of like in Hinduism, where the Atman needs to realize that through the illusion of separateness. In Buddhism, you need to be able to see through the illusion of a fixed reality. There is no fixed reality. There is even no fixed you. And seeing through that and overcoming ignorance of that, of how everything's in flux, enables you to realize the anatman and everything's fleeting, and that allows you to live a life of less attachment, and less attachment will bring you less suffering. The wheel of birth and death. So there is samsara in Buddhism. The Buddha inherited some really basic Hindu metaphysical concepts, like you are constantly reborn and die. However, this gets messy because there is no eternal, independently existing soul to be reborn. However, there's still a chain of cause and effect, karma. So there are sort of like these streams of karmic energy that you are a part of, and your stream of karmic energy has flowed through a chain of lives that have died and been born. So your karmic energy is sort of reborn and dies. So it's kind of like in Hinduism. Think about billiards or pool. If you're playing pool, it'd be like the ball itself is like reinserted into different bodies and is reborn. In Buddhism, it's more like there's karmic energy that hits the ball, and then the ball moves and it dies and it hits another ball, and that momentum or karmic energy allows that second ball to move. So that's how a way of understanding how rebirth works in Buddhism, without the concept of an Atman, but rather the concept of an Anatman. And the wheel of samsara operates, it's a negative thing, and it operates because life involves suffering, and it operates through affliction. And these are the three afflictions: attachment or greed, so just intense desire; aversion or hatred; and delusion or ignorance. And that would be ignorance of how everything is unstable and impermanent and in flux. And interestingly enough, is a concept of a bodhisattva in Buddhism. And this is a Buddha or an individual that became enlightened, became a Buddha, and decided, instead of escaping samsara, chose to be reborn into another life in order to help other beings attain enlightenment. So it's greater to be a bodhisattva than anything else. And the Buddha is thought to be a bodhisattva that was enlightened in other lives as well. And so the goal of Buddhist thought is to become enlightened, but there's a tradition of not only that, but helping others to attain enlightenment as well. So more about nirvana. So again, it means extinguishing or to extinguish, and it means to end or extinguish the cycle of dukkha. And in order to do that, one must end all craving and lead a life free of attachment that has no karmic consequences. And then an arhat is another word for a worthy one that has found nirvana in this life. Kind of like a jina in Jainism. So, some questions. What are major similarities and differences between Hinduism and Buddhism? So at this point, some of the similarities are a concept of samsara, life of rebirth, karma is similar. The major difference would be Hindus posit a self or soul or substance to reality Brahman that is manifest as the Atman, whereas Buddhists claim that there is no self and that there is in fact an Anatman, and you need to be able to explain what that means, and that'd be that the self is really a bundle of fleeting perceptions. There's no fixed self. What is the middle way, and what events in Siddhartha's life before his enlightenment guided him to the middle way? So the middle way refers to the Dharma being a path between extreme self-indulgence and extreme self-denial or asceticism. And this is because Siddhartha lived a life of extreme self-indulgence for his first 29 years, and then experienced 6 years of asceticism, and found that both of those extremes did not lead to enlightenment. Therefore, he was guided to a middle way of moderation. What is the concept of dukkha, and what is its role in Buddhist teaching? So the concept of dukkha refers to pain, dissatisfaction, and suffering. And the goal of all Buddhist teaching is to focus on earthly suffering and its cure. So dukkha is one of the three marks of existence. There's a fixation on ending it, and it's also thought to be an inevitable part of existence. Describe the nature of the self, the Anatman, in Buddhist tradition. We kind of did that with the first question, but whereas the Atman in Hinduism is a substance, it's a soul, it's a self, it's one with a substance or God, the Anatman is the absence of a self, the absence of a soul, and that the self is really a bundle of perceptions that are fleeting, that are structured in such a way that the self experiences itself as something, but really all that exists are these perceptions. And it'd be cool to explain how reincarnation works with the Anatman, where karmic energy is reincarnated, not a self. And what role does anitya play in Buddhist thought? Well, you need to know that anitya refers to impermanence, and it is the idea that nothing in reality has independent existence and is permanent. Everything is in flux and changing, and for that reason it doesn't make sense to become overly attached or overly crave things, since everything is impermanent. And we will stop there, and this will be the first part, and there will be a second part to Lecture 5.